Capitalism, what is it like? I would say a bit of a disaster all round. Many of the terrible injustices and crises which define our society, obviously their roots is the economic system which we have, which is rotten. But are we doomed just to be stuck under the system? What the hell is this system? Let's make some sense of it. And to do that, actually, we have the best possible guest in the world, which is the incredible Grace Blakeley, who has a masterpiece of a book, which is now out, called Vulture Capitalism, Corporate Crimes, Backdoor Bailouts, and wait for it, The Death of Freedom. Bom, bom, bom. It's quite a dramatic, let's be honest. I think we're both quite dramatic, actually, to be honest, Grace. There's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with drama, but that is dramatic. I just read that.
It is dramatic. I actually, we were like brainstorming the title for ages and eventually landed on Vulture Capitalism. And I came up with the subtitle because I really wanted to get across this point that capitalism is this system that actually like undermines human freedom. Because, you know, we've had for like a long time this argument from the right, particularly like the neoliberals like Thatcher and Reagan and people that, you know, the problem with socialism is that there's this massive state that crushes human freedom and capitalism is all about free markets. And then actually, you know, the experience that most of us have had over however many years of neoliberalism is a massive state bailing out massive corporations, which have literally nothing to do with the free market. They just make decisions and they're able to do that because, you know, they are large and powerful and insulated from any accountability. So I really wanted to like push back against that and say, no, actually socialism is like the tradition of socialists is the tradition of organizing to build and promote human freedom. And our whole critique of capitalism is that it undermines freedom. It keeps people trapped in, you know, jobs that they don't like. It prevents them from kind of organizing to change the world. It like, you know, creates this political class that is completely out of touch and completely unaccountable and prevents us from kind of fighting back against it. So yeah, I wanted to show that actually this longer term tradition of socialist organizing is about making us free.
I love that because, yeah, I mean, you're right. That's a traditional argument used to batter the left, isn't it? Which is that, you know, neoliberalism is popularized as will give you your personal freedom, your individual liberty. The dead weight of the state and collectivism is infringing on your liberty. We will give you freedom, which I suppose then is lived as insecurity rather than freedom. But vulture capitalism, we'll ask you about that. But what the hell is it? Go on, define it. What are we talking about?
So what I'm talking about in the book is this kind of toxic fusion between public and private power in service of the interests of those at the very top. Vulture capitalism is just capitalism, really. I mean, realistically speaking, and that is going to be an argument that I'm going to hear a lot over the next few months. And it's absolutely true. But, you know, I wanted to kind of, as I said, bring through this point about the fact that capitalism doesn't mean free markets. I think, you know, perhaps because of the legacy of like, you know, capitalism versus socialism being America versus the USSR. There's this idea that capitalism is decentralized free markets and democracy, whereas socialism is like centralized state planning and autocracy. And I wanted to kind of drill down into that because it's at the heart of the neoliberal critique developed by someone like, you know, Friedrich Hayek in The Road to Serfdom, one of the kind of foremost theorists of neoliberalism, who basically said that any kind of social democratic measures, so any attempt to insulate people from the caprices of the free market, any attempt to kind of intervene in the market, say through kind of, you know, the state investing in the economy, is inevitably going to lead to kind of autocracy and curtail people's freedom. And he said that because he argued that the economy is too complex to plan. And that's kind of where I start. I say in the beginning of the book, you know, what if we actually took Hayek seriously? Maybe, you know, the left needs to engage with Hayek. And I argue that, you know, this critique is kind of correct. Like the economy, society is too complex to be centrally planned by any one institution. The problem with capitalism is that there are a bunch of really large, powerful institutions that plan everything. You know, they work together to plan who gets what. And that's the biggest and most powerful corporations, the biggest and most powerful financial institutions, the biggest and most powerful governments and states. And far from being a kind of counterweight to corporate power, most of the time, most governments work alongside corporate executives and financiers to basically kind of protect the status quo. And the example I use in the book, well, I use loads of examples in the book because, you know, this all sounds quite abstract. It's important, I think, to kind of bring it back to real world examples. But the example I open with in the book is the example of Boeing, Now, this is like a massive company that's been in the news recently, because most recently, one of the doors blew off one of its planes mid-flight. But a few years ago, you might remember that a couple of Boeing planes kind of flew out of the sky, basically. They like dove out of the sky, nosedived out of the sky, and killed like around 350 people in 2 separate crashes. And the same thing basically happened in both of these crashes. It was a software fix that had been developed to make these planes, allegedly safe, caused them to kind of nosedive out of the sky, and there was nothing that the pilots could do about it. And it emerged later that Boeing senior executives had known about this problem, they'd known about this flaw in the design of the plane, but they had basically covered it up. They'd removed a reference to this software system in the pilot manuals. The regulator that was supposed to be regulating them, it was actually operating from a unit inside Boeing whose staff were paid by Boeing. So obviously the FAA didn't stand in the way. And this kind of looks like, it's another big company kind of putting profits before people. That's classic capitalism. But what's interesting about the Boeing story is how deeply enmeshed Boeing is with the American state. It's this deep part of the US military industrial complex. It has very close links with the Pentagon, with Department of Defense, with various different areas of the US state, with the Treasury. It was the biggest recipient of corporate welfare in the US. So it had tons of tax cuts, tons of support during COVID, even after it was revealed that these executives had covered up this, this failure, basically, this massive safety failure. They still got this huge bailout through the US state. And I think what this shows, again, is that, capitalism isn't a free market system. The US is the world's foremost capitalist economy. Boeing is this massive capitalist institution. And it doesn't operate in a free market. It operates in a monopolistic market structure. And if anything bad does actually happen to it, if the market comes knocking, you do start to see any competition or, its share price start to fall, what happens? The American state comes in and rescues the company. So this, I'm saying, is what capitalism is. And this is, a Marxist analysis, basically. This is, Marx saying the capitalist state is nothing but a committee for managing the affairs of the bourgeoisie. And it's kind of ironic that the left has become in many people's minds, the party of the big state, because people like Marx, who sit in this tradition of socialism as freedom, they were always critiquing the centralization of authority in the hands of politicians and big corporations working together to prop up capitalism.
On that, just in terms of the relationship between capitalism and the state, I'm just worried in terms of like the kind of, I don't know, how we kind of unpick or, well, I mean, take, for example, another economic super brain, Mariana Mazzucato. She talks about the entrepreneurial state. And so the argument, as you know, but just for everyone else is obviously, this better than me, but the benefit of everyone listening if they don't, which is, I don't know, my iPhone here. And people will go, well, this is, shows how dynamic capitalism is. Look how great capitalism is. But actually, if we go through GPS, the internet, chips in it, even algorithms, all these big components were actually came out of state-funded research. But so I'm trying to work out how do we kind of like have the, because people then we will often make the argument this shows actually that it's not all about the
state is good. Yeah,
exactly. So but what you're saying at the same this other analysis was actually, well, this is these are businesses which are propped up by the state, and that's so how do we have that? How do we disentangle?
Really glad you asked that, because this discussion of what state power is and how it operates within capitalism is really central to the argument in the book. And basically my argument is that the state, like any institution, the outcomes that we see coming out of the development of policy reflect the balance of power in society as a whole. And this is actually a logic that you can apply to any institution. So corporations, for example, if you see the labor share of national income rise, so workers getting paid higher wages, basically, that will have to do with a shift in the balance of power in favor of workers and away from bosses. And it shapes the internal structure of the corporation. It probably also means workers have a bit more power to kind of set their conditions, to, resist, the authority of their managers, etc. And that will be because there's been this shift in the balance of power. In the same way, what happens within the state reflects the balance of power within society as a whole. So, this argument isn't the capitalist state has never done anything for workers, because of course it has. We have the NHS, we have public services, we have, labor market regulation. But where did that all come from? It didn't come from state bureaucrats or even politicians saying, we've had this great new idea, let's invent the health service. It came from workers organising and demanding the introduction of a national health service. It also actually came from the existence of local kind of community and employment organizations like friendly societies, for example, that provided healthcare at the grassroots and that were able to provide another foundation for advocacy on behalf of a kind of the expansion of healthcare, basically. So the changes that we see within the state, the policy shifts that we see within the state, reflect the balance of power in society as a whole, and the balance of power in society as a whole reflects the strength, basically, of workers versus capital, among a number of other different things. So when working people are organized, as they were, for example, in the period after the Second World War, and they were able to disrupt the economy to basically scare the ruling classes into giving them what they wanted, then you saw more public investment, more investment in public services, kind of more pro-worker policies across the board. Now, the interesting thing about the Mazzucato argument, which I don't dispute at all, she's completely right to point out that most of a significant portion of the kind of big technological shifts that require huge amounts of upfront investment to develop came from state funding, basically, and a lot of it is actually Department of Defense funding. What's interesting is the way that model is rolled out and the way that it's used to support private vested interests, right? I think an interesting example of this is like NASA technology, because NASA obviously is the source of a lot of kind of new technological development in the same way as the armed forces also require that. And what NASA does with a lot of this new technology is it basically comes up with these brilliant ideas and then allows private organizations to basically take over the use of these technologies and to profit from what has been public research. And this is the same thing with the iPhone, like Apple and all the big tech companies make tons and tons of money from an investment that has been undertaken by the public sector, by taxpayers, basically. So once again, you see the state stepping in to provide private profits to capitalists, basically. It's like the socialization of investment and the privatization of profit. Mazzucato is right to argue that this shows that the state has the capacity to do things that those on the right say it doesn't have the capacity to do. So a lot of people on the right say, oh, the state couldn't possibly come up with anything interesting. It's too bureaucratic. Only the market could deliver the kind of advances in technology that we've seen over the history of capitalism. But she stops short of pointing out that the reason that the state does these things is firstly to kind of, project its own imperial power. Generally, it's not a coincidence that this stuff happens generally within the Department of Defense, but also it makes sure that any technological development that it does sponsor does not upset the balance of power in society. So it isn't used to, we don't see enough public investment in developing new drugs, in healthcare, in, supporting technologies that are actually going to help people. We see it in the military, and then private corporations are able to profit from it. So basically, the question isn't state or market. It's not like which is good and which is bad, like which of these institutions works and which doesn't. The question that we have to be asking ourselves is who has the power in our society and how can we take that back?
And on that, well, speaking of, hold on. No, hats. Very professional, as you can see, very professional setup. Speaking of who's got the power, this little mug does just because of his sheer irritation. He's irritating and he has huge power over him because.
And you know what? We should be irritating if we want to upset the status quo.
Well, it works for him because he upsets the status quo all the time.
Yeah, exactly.
And lots of glasses of water, which he nearly destroyed my computer twice. Just in terms of that, because often again the confusion between statism and say socialism is, this might sound a bit random, but it's just a case in point in terms of, I suppose, in terms of what you're saying, because apartheid South Africa, most of its economy was nationalised. No one would say that was a socialist economy. Similarly, it's quite interesting, Singapore, isn't it? Which is often highlighted as a kind of libertarian paradise because it's got very low taxes, but almost all the land is state-owned, and actually through state-owned economy enterprises, a lot of the state is basically directing the economy, isn't it? So you actually get, in those cases, Singapore is not something we aspire to, it's on the left. Yeah. So that shows it's about whose interests is society organised, and it's not about, the more nationalisation, the more it's
exactly.
Socialist.
I think, the problem is that we've kind of got this chicken and egg problem of everyone sees policies as the way to change things rather than seeing policies as the effect of class struggle. And if you look over the course of history, that is what we see. The neoliberal policy shift. Obviously, policies do change things, but they are introduced and implemented and actually developed in the context of shifts in class power. So like the neoliberal shift, for example, that transformed our economy in favor of capital. It radically shifted the balance of power in favor of capital by, you know, decimating the labor movement, introducing, you know, privatization, dramatically expanding the power of the finance sector, curtailing workers' rights, all these different sorts of things. But it was driven by, firstly, a combination of a shift in, you know, the global economy, technological change, globalization, the fall of the USSR. All these things were already shifting the balance of power away from organized labor and in favor of capital. But then also the coordinated organizing of a group of people who wanted to see that shift away from organized labor become consolidated and institutionalized. So if we're thinking about, right, how do we organize a shift like away from neoliberalism, basically, the question we should be asking ourselves isn't like obviously policies are important. So like part of this has to be thinking about what policies we should be implementing. But the question that needs to be asked is like, how do you build power to create the like broader political shift that is going to provide the foundations of that policy transformation? And I think, you know, this argument was always present around like the movement around Corbynism, but there was this idea that we could have this shortcut, right? That like we didn't have the class basis for the development of Corbynism. You know, the labor movement wasn't strong enough. The wider kind of social movement wasn't quite strong enough. But if we could just kind of grab hold of state power, then we could use it to shift things. And there was some merit in that, in the sense that had he been elected, he would undoubtedly have been able to shift things somewhat. The problem is that without those foundations, that movement was just so open to being crushed by forces that wanted to maintain the status quo. So if we want to see, you know, anything like that happen again and succeed, or if we even want to see any progressive policy whatsoever implemented by any government over the course of the next, you know, however many years, then that has to come from people organizing in our workplaces, in our communities, on the streets, just really like manifesting and like manifesting that like political shift and building power from the grassroots.
Just wondering, just to ask, you know, what could happen next. It's quite interesting because you're talking about obviously the rise of neoliberalism and what that is, crushing of labour and all the rest of it. Liz Truss was right in that. She said that there had been stagnant economic growth since the 1980s. She didn't seem to join the dots there. So what happened in the 1980s, Liz? What happened in the 1980s?
Yeah.
Which is obviously we have Thatcherism. The promise of Thatcherism was, you know, Britain was the sick man of Europe and we would get lots of growth and all the rest of it and everyone would be prosperous and all boats would rise and all the rest of it. But we, in the 70s, we had the same average growth as the 80s. It was less evenly distributed. In the 90s, growth was lower. And then since then, it's been lower or stagnant, but much below the post-war consensus. So what does that tell us? But also, I suppose, so we just devil's advocate thing. People go, well, you know, people say, look, it's lifted all these people out of poverty all around the world in that period. It creates the wealth. And that's what's happened.
So, I mean, in a way, that is true. And like, you know, I come from a Marxist analysis, and Marx was always very ready to admit that capitalism had given rise to technological and productive shifts that, you know, hadn't been possible under feudalism, say, the social system that had preceded it. And that particularly the nature of kind of competition and the accumulation of capital meant that you would see kind of technological development of the kind that you'd never really seen in all of human history, and that technology would become a kind of industry in itself. But what he also pointed out was that, that process also created kind of inherent contradictions that would, on some readings, like bring the system down, and other readings create the conditions within which the system may fail. And ultimately, those were the kinds of things that socialists need to be paying attention to, and building power to to kind of bring to fruition. So what am I coming back to? Oh yeah, okay. Sorry. So yeah, the kind of slowdown in growth that we've seen in recent years comes from a number of different sources, and there's a lot of different kind of scholarship and analysis on this, that we've seen kind of secular stagnation. So that means kind of long-term stagnation in rates of economic growth. And that could come from a number of different sources. So, there is this analysis that says that like technological development has actually slowed down, and that part of the reason that that's happened has been that we have this massive kind of concentration and centralization within the economy, where there's like a small number of very big and powerful corporations that don't really have the incentive to innovate in order to compete. And why is that? Well, because they are these huge monopolistic corporations that not only are kind of relatively insulated from the effects of competition, but which are also propped up by the state if they ever get into trouble. That kind of sapping of productive power is arguably what is underlying the long-term kind of stagnation of the economy. At the same time, as we have also seen a kind of austerity in a lot of different parts of the world. So the state stepping back from what was once this kind of Keynesian model of when the economy fails, will invest, and the inherent fragilities that have emerged in the financial system as well. Again, as states have tried to plug the gaps in this failing model. So if you look back to the period before the financial crisis, for example, that boom that we saw that ultimately burst, the bubble that burst in 2008, and I write about this in the book, it was partly inflated by states.
Right, yeah.
So, for example, you wouldn't have had the massive boom in mortgage-backed securities that you saw in the US had it not been for the massive role played by quasi-public organizations in the US, like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. The same thing, it can be said for the regulatory environment, for the role of the ratings agencies. There was this whole architecture, much of it supported by the state, that was geared towards basically supporting the profits of the banks and actually shifting a lot of the risk of what they were doing onto the public sector. So that was another way of kind of covering over these long-term fragilities that had emerged within the economy up to that point. And then when that model crashed, as it was inevitably going to, those fragilities emerge once again. And what's interesting is that you see that same process happening now in a lot of other places where they've had this housing bubble after 2008. China is an interesting example of where that's happening now, of a big financial bubble in the housing market, and that kind of, creating problems when it comes to long-term growth. So you see this long-term trend in the system towards a slowdown in the rate of innovation and a slowdown in productivity that has become very, very obvious. And then you see all the mechanisms that are used to kind of attempt to get around that, whether that's the state kind of attempting to support the profits of the private sector, or whether it's the private sector coming up with all of these crazy new tricks to try and generate profits out of nowhere. And that's kind of the context in which we live today. And when it comes to, supporting the profits of private corporations in the context of slower growth, if growth isn't the thing that's supporting profits, then, the thing has to be slashing costs. It has to be, gouging consumers often. It has to be cutting wages, eroding, workers' bargaining power, just basically extracting from everyone else in the economy rather than delivering any kind of new innovation.
So, in terms of hopeful, let's do a little hopeful end segue. I might end by asking about Labour, which won't be hopeful, but just in terms of alternatives, because again, a lot of people go, well, look, you had your chance, guys, in terms of creating another system, and every other system failed. Lots of obviously regimes which claim to be an alternative to capitalism clothed themselves in that kind of rhetoric, but committed terrible crimes and shut down human freedom. And that's where inevitably me and you, Grace, are going to lead to more totalitarianism. I mean, look at us. We're clearly dictators.
Crazy.
Yeah, we've just got that kind of power mad look in our eyes.
I know, right?
But that's you can see how people can look at the point of the 20th century and look at Stalinism and think, look, that's where this ends. So what is the alternative if it isn't basically Stalinism and people being all sent to gulags. We don't have a list for gulag, I promise.
So the alternative is building democracy. You know, like the whole point of this book is to say that you're not going to end capitalism just by allowing the state to control more and more areas of the economy. Like the Chinese state controls vast swathes of the economy, and that is still a capitalist economy. It's still, you know, producing commodities for profit, and, you know, enriching a small number of people at the very top and empowering a small number of people at the very top in the process, and also, you know, exploiting workers to do so. So just getting the state to do more stuff isn't going to end capitalism. What is required is, as I've kind of been talking about this whole show, is this shift in the balance of power in favor of workers, and, you know, an attack on the consolidated power of those at the top of our society. So the ways that I look at kind of affecting this shift are basically through a deepening of democracy. So this is the kind of antithesis of that kind of argument of, like, you know, they want to take away your freedom. And, you know, when it basically emerges from the fact that, you know, my analysis of capitalism shows that there are these huge concentrations of power at the very top of the economy, that there are a small number of people who get to basically plan to a greater or lesser extent who gets what, and that the opposite of that isn't the state doing everything, because the state does a lot now. It just does a lot to support the interests of capital. The opposite of that is pulling power down to the grassroots. So it's kind of empowering ordinary people to organize in their workplaces, in their communities, on the streets, and really like instituting reforms that allow you know, communities a greater say over, let's say, local government, that allow workers a greater say in the governance of their organizations, and that allow citizens a greater say in how the government works. And all of these things they're meant to kind of be reforms in themselves, but they're also meant to kind of affect this longer term shift in favor of workers. And, like, you know, I look at so many different examples in the book of, like, places where this has happened in the past or is even happening now. So there are some really kind of exciting local level examples of community organizing where people are kind of, you know, building from the grassroots, like, new participatory democratic structures. I look at this, you know, town in North Wales that ended up becoming a town with the most community enterprises per capita, because all of these local people just kind of came together and said, we're going to build a different kind of economy. We're going to build a community-owned energy company. We're going to start kind of linking up all the social enterprises in the area, and making sure that we're kind of employing local people, that we're supporting people through the pandemic, using the power of community basically to, you know, fight back against the extractive economic model that had, you know, left their place. You know, it become like a left behind area, and all these politicians were like, you know, how do we fix, like, the left behind areas? And the answer in Blind Eye Festinian was, oh, we're going to do it ourselves. We're actually going to organize, and we're going to build a new model. And yeah, then I look at how that can be scaled up, and how, you know, we might democratize society by kind of delivering real democracy in the area of politics. So there's a lot, obviously, to be said for kind of transforming the way that British democracy works. But there are also lots of other, you know, like, basically kind of doing away with, like, the feudal hangovers, like the House of Lords and the monarchy and things. But there's lots of other stuff that needs to be done. Like, for example, you know, there are various areas of the state, like central banking, that have been insulated from democratic accountability, and that need to be, like, people's voices need to be brought back into those policymaking processes. And I think, you know, the big thing that I realized while writing the book was that the only way this happens is if we start to really push back against individualism. And, like, I think a big problem with trying to organize people today, a big problem with really trying to develop any progressive political project, is that we have this legacy of neoliberalism, which is that everyone is encouraged to see themselves as this, like, isolated, atomized, individual, household, entrepreneur, consumer. You know, you're not a worker, you're an entrepreneur. You're not a citizen, you're a consumer of public services. And, you know, politics is confined to something that you do as an individual in a voting booth. And that's really, like, undermined people's sense of agency. It's made them feel powerless, and it's allowed our ruling classes basically to get away with so much, because there aren't these kind of collective organizations that are capable of bringing people together to resist things. So, like, a big part of what I wanted to do in the book was to say, you know, the thing that really sustains capitalism on, like, on just like a day-to-day basis is our personal belief that we are alone. Basically, we're struggling in this competitive environment to kind of try and like get up this hierarchy, and that we don't have any power to change things. Because I think most people know that the system is broken, but they don't feel like they have the power to change things. And like fighting back against that sense of powerlessness is, I think, the most important first step to building any kind of movement that's going to be able to transform our economy.
Well, just lastly on that, could be a Labour government by the end of the year. It's inevitable. The Conservatives have destroyed themselves. Maybe the alternative will be born then under a Labour government with Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves. Oh, you're laughing.
Yeah,
Laughing. Oh, why so cynical?
Well, Owen, I have many reasons to be cynical about the potential of a Labour government in office. Firstly, the things that they're saying, so their actual policies. Which
that's a clue. Don't get me wrong; it's a clue, isn't it?
It's a good clue. If they actually deliver on what they're saying they're going to deliver in office, then we will see effectively no change in the nature of the economy. There'll be effectively no new money for public services because they've got this absurd and completely discredited fiscal credibility rule that says they need to balance spending over the first 5 years of their first term in office. And they've also, alongside that, said there's going to be no tax rises on corporations or the wealthy. So the combination of those two things means there's basically not going to be any money for public services. This is not a novel point. Paul Johnson of the IFS said this the other day. He said both parties need to get real because they're basically both promising kind of effectively cuts to public services, or at least, not allowing spending to increase alongside demand. And that is not something that they're communicating to the electorate. So this isn't just me. This is, something that Paul Johnson of the IFS, it's just like middle of the road, centrist dad think tank is saying as well. And the other thing that's, I think, important to point out is that a lot of the other policies that Labour was kind of saying it would deliver, things like, workers' rights, decarbonisation, all of those are getting removed or dramatically watered down. Now, a lot of this is under the influence of big vested interests that have a real tight grip on the Labour Party and particularly on Keir Starmer's team. So, what Wes Streeting is saying about, we can't possibly afford to fund the NHS, so we need to bring in private providers. Firstly, it's wrong, but secondly, it comes from the influence that like the private healthcare lobby has over the Labour Party at the moment, and that is going to potentially lead to even greater privatisation of the NHS. So that's something that we've got to be resisting. But also, like Keir Starmer's house building policy, for example, it has no investment from the public sector for house building. The idea is just that they're going to stimulate private developers to suddenly deliver loads of new housing, when we know that the problem with the housing market is there's loads of private developers which operate only for profit. They're able to buy up loads of land, benefit from capital gains when planning permission is granted, and then slowly drip housing into the market to make sure that prices don't fall too much and that their profits are maintained. So what Labour is delivering, or will probably deliver, is this very middle of the road agenda that doesn't really challenge the status quo, but which does help to enrich a lot of kind of companies with close links to the Labour Party. And we know from history and just a cursory glance at everything that's ever happened, that most political projects become less radical when confronted with the inherent conservatism of the institutions of the British state. So, when a government changes, a lot of things remain the same. Like the civil service remains the same, the Bank of England remains the same, the kind of people in defence and the army and all of these different things, the corporations that surround the state and the kind of outsourcing agencies, all of those remain the same. Lots of things stay the same. And the individuals within those organizations and institutions tend to have this kind of conservative bias. They want things to remain largely as they are because that's how they got rich. That's how they got into the positions that they're in now. And that tends to drag even, radical political projects towards the center and away from kind of progressive social change. So for people who are saying Labour's going to be more radical when they get into government, I have some bad news for you. But what we can potentially hope for is that everyone else starts to get organised. And that is something that could potentially drag, kicking and screaming, the Labour Party into at least being marginally less bad. And it is really the only thing historically that has dragged the Labour Party towards more progressive policies, has been the organisation of the Labour movement, people like protesting on the streets, the people organizing in their communities, local government historically. There's like the GLC were often outposts of kind of socialist power and, experiments in democratic planning. I write a bit about that in the book. So, we really have to ask ourselves when inevitably Labour government is formed, and that is always going to happen. There's absolutely no question about it. The Tory party is effectively defunct as a political project for now. When that happens, what are we going to be doing to make sure that their worst policies, the impact of those are kind of lessened, and secondly, we're getting them to actually do potentially something maybe good.
Time to get organised. We need to prepare everyone, and I think there's some exciting things in the pipeline, which we'll see. We'll see what happens.
I've also heard that, so let's see.
Who knows what will happen, guys? We just don't know. But getting organised, and I would also say, sometimes we all have our bleak moments. Look at the state of the world; it's horrific. But what does give me hope is I think the left, after terrible defeats in the 80s, etc., it kind of was defined by what it was against rather than for. It was intellectually and politically exhausted. It's things like stop privatization, very defensive. But now we do actually have lots of brilliant thinkers like yourself who actually are both analysing the world around us and also presenting really exciting ideas. And that gives huge hope for the future, because what we need are movements and ideas. And we have a great range of people who are actually sickeningly, genuinely young, rather than me, who's now, well, I'm not going to say how old I am, but I'm a geriatric millennial.
Yeah, but I mean, it doesn't matter because you look about 12, so.
I'll take that. I used to hate it when people said that, and now I'm like, thank God. No. That's like my life raft.
I would rather look young than be young.
Well, you are both, and that's what's annoying about you. You look young, and you also are young. Whereas I'm just a con man, physically speaking. Anyway, look, a brilliant book. Make sure everyone you get it. Vulture Capitalism, Corporate Crimes, Backdoor Bailouts, and the Death of Freedom by the wonderful Grace Blakeley, who gives me hope because she has lots of great ideas. And there's a whole generation of people, and people read people like Grace's books, and then they get excited and they want to come up with ideas, and that's how we're going to change the world. So, yes, buy her book now if you haven't done it. What a disgrace. Do press like and subscribe, and share the video, and a big round of applause to Grace. Thank you, Grace.
Thank you.